the Constitution established many rights. Among the rights that the Constitution now protects is the right to the protection of your property, including intellectual property. Copyright is one of the intellectual property which Kenyans own most commonly. Musicians are copyright holders, and the Constitution has established institutions to execute the mandate of making those rights protection a reality so that they can earn from their living. In pursuance to that execution of the mandate, Kenya Copyright Board has been licensing the 3 collective management organizations, namely Music Copyright Society, Kenya Association of Music Producers, and PRISK, Performers' Rights Society of Kenya. For your information, these licenses have just been renewed, and you shall be seeing the Gazette shortly. Now, as we have been listening to users of music, and they have always had a difficulty understanding your tariffs, or even knowing which tariff is proper or not. Because most of the staff working for the CMOs sometimes keep raising and reducing the tariffs every time they visit. So uncertainty is not good for business. For that reason, 2 years ago, the Kenya Copyright Board inserted a clause to require that tariffs must be gazetted by the minister, who is the Attorney General. Yes, the other message we have got over the years is that the 3 societies are confusing, and they are engaged in infighting, and they are wasteful because all of them levy from similar businesses, hence causing waste and ending up in resulting in artists not receiving their due, since all of you have very high operating costs. So my board this year has placed a condition that none of the societies shall be operating alone. And we have been waiting for the joint tariff for a few months. I received it last month, and this is the inaugural meeting to discuss and understand the rationale behind the tariffs. And for me, this marks the beginning. We do not have to finish this conversation today. This conversation is supposed to proceed with the discussions between the 3 CMOs on one hand, and the specific business association on the other hand. That means, since the interests of, let's say, PERAP may be divergent with those of media owners or the matatu owners, and their tariffs are different, the discussions must be held directly with each of those institutions, or where there is a common interest, like in the case of KHC and PERAC, we would like to see them sitting with the collective management organization. So it's an assurance from my office that we shall not have any tariff that has not been exhaustively discussed. Preference is that the discussion shall reach an agreement for us to apply that tariff.
So copyright and related rights, these are just brief definitions that I thought it would be good to leave up there as you read them. I'll just highlight. These are all areas of intellectual property. And the copyright is the exclusive bundle of rights held by the creators, in this particular context, of musical works. And that would be the authors, the people who write the lyrics, the composers, the people who come up with the instrumentation or the melodies, the arrangers, the people who decide how the song will be performed or played or organized, and then the publishers as well, who help to market and manage the licensing rights of that musical work. And these are held exclusively. This is important because you as the copyright holder are the ones to then give permission to somebody else to administer these rights for you. So even as we sit here, some of these organizations are representing rights holders who are their members, which means these musician or musical work holders have given them permission to do the work that they're doing, as well as the copyright board license. Related rights are the relatives, literally, of copyright. And whereas these are not, well, they're not defined as copyright works per se, but related rights, because these cover the people, whether they're legal entities like record labels, for example, or individuals like performers who have contributed something, some creative thing to the process or some financial thing to this musical work. So for example, you would find the performers, the musical singers, the instrumentalists who have played a role in studio for that sound recording to come out, the record labels or the producers who have paid for that recording and master to come out. So all this is basically to say that over time there's been very many meetings and lobbying sessions for different countries who are all members of WIPO, and it has been agreed that it deems that the role that these people play is worthy of some legal protection. All right, and these are the beneficiaries that we would see, the performers in both music and audiovisual works, and the producers of phonograms or owners of sound recordings or record labels. Broadcasters are also part of this group of related rights. Are we clear about the difference between the two? I'm going to assume silence means yes. All right, let's go to the next stage. Now, the legal provisions are mainly held within the Copyright Act of 2001, CAP 130, which is the Copyright Act of Kenya. And they are 5 sections that I'd like to highlight. Section 26 talks about the nature of copyright in literary, musical, or artistic works, and audiovisual works as well. And that's captured in section 26. And that is basically where the members, in this case of Music Copyright Society of Kenya, would derive their legal right to be able to have that creative process protected. Section 28 covers the nature of the copyright in a sound recording. The person who has made the financial arrangements, literally paid, for this particular master or sound recording to exist. The sound recording is the thing that comes out of the studio process, okay? Section 30 covers the rights of performers. In Kenya, we cover both musicians, who are the musical work performers, and the actors, who are the audiovisual work performers. That was an amendment made in 2012, following the signing and ratification of the Beijing Treaty in July, I believe, of 2012. Section 30A introduces something called the equitable right to remuneration for sound recordings and audiovisual works. And I put the actual provision there because it's important for our context, and I will read it. It says, if a sound recording is published for commercial purposes, or a reproduction of such recording is used directly for broadcasting and other communication to the public, or it is publicly performed, a single equitable remuneration for the performer and the producer of the sound recording shall be paid by the user through the respective collective management organizations, and the remuneration shall be shared equally by the producer of the sound recording and the performer. This particular provision relates purely to the KAMP and PRISK bodies because they are the ones that handle the related rights, all right? And Section 26, as I said earlier, will cover the Music Copyright Society members. Finally, Section 46. This covers collective administration of copyright, and it is basically the provision that tells you who can run its operations as a collective management organization or collecting society. It is somebody who has met certain criteria that are laid out in the Act and that receive a license from the Kenya Copyright Board for that purpose. So these are the 5 provisions that I think are crucial and give us the legal mandate, not just from Kekobo's point of view, but from the 3 CMOs, because it tells you the right of the creative players, and then it also tells you that they have the right exclusively and from an equitable point of view to assign or to license somebody else who is properly licensed by Kekobo to go out and collect their monies. Now, collective management, what is this thing? It is the exercise of these 2 rights that we've talked about, copyright and related rights, by organizations who are acting in the interest and on behalf of various rights holders, which was the point I made earlier, that these people who hold the rights in those 3 sections of the Act can give these organizations their mandate to represent them and administer those rights on their behalf. And the justification comes from the fact that, yes, as a rights holder, there are things one can do on an individual basis. They can decide how many copies, physical copies of their song will be made. They can decide, if you're a writer, if your play will actually be staged on, put on as a play on a stage. Those rights belong to them exclusively, and they can handle those rights by themselves. So if I am an author, somebody can walk up to me and say, I'd like to perform your play, can I? They do not need to go to a collective body to ask for that permission. They can come and handle it directly with me. However, we understand that there are other rights that cannot practically be managed on an individual basis. These ones are things like broadcasting, for example. It would be completely impractical for every single rights holder, the authors, the composers, the publishers, the arrangers, the performers, the actors, to walk to each and every media house every morning and say, today you played my song 1 time, please give me some money. You've played it a 2nd time, come and give me some more money. And it would be impractical for the broadcasters as well to keep going to get permission on what we call a pay-as-you-go basis. It's not practical. So that is why some of these rights, the same thing for venues such as kinyozis or salons or restaurants or nightclubs, pubs, hotels, it would be completely impractical for these individuals to go to these venues and seek payment, or for the venues in return to seek a license to use this music on a day-to-day basis. And this is the reason why these rights are managed collectively. So these rights holders have a common aim or a common need, and it is managed by this body. What are the roles of these CMOs? It is to negotiate, number 1. And then it is to collect from each of these radio, TV stations, or any other users that I have mentioned, for each of the uses of these songs, or audiovisual works, or sound recordings, and vice versa. And then to distribute those monies to the rights holders. That is the reason why collective management was born, because it was not practically possible. It used to happen that way, but it was not practically possible to continue. Next slide, please. So this has basically revolutionized. We are in Kenya and the tongue is heavy. The need for music users to have to seek this permission, as I said earlier. The term that was used that I thought was interesting is pay as you go. So every time you want to use it, you pay and you continue. And the next time you want to use it, you pay and you continue. So this is the change that happened. CMOs then became the liaison between the music creators and the music users, so that you are a basic middle person who can help to bring 2 things to the table: a level of efficiency and a level of effectiveness, and then provide, instead of 2,500 licenses in a year, you can get 1 license that covers the different types of uses that you would go through within that period of time, which is a year. And collective management also, I think, on the other flip side, the benefit for the creators is that now you don't have to run around being the one to stand outside in different offices and receptions and on the streets of different cities trying to decide how to collect this money. You can go and concentrate on doing what you do best, which is create, yeah, and make more music and make more literary works and everything else that you do. So allowing these works to then work for you and bring in a certain amount of revenue, not for now, but also for the future. So just to highlight some of the various uses, we had mentioned broadcasting, communication to the public or performances in public places, digital distribution through downloading and streaming, blank media levies, among others. Now, CMOs are usually registered as not-for-profit organizations, and they are private member companies because each of these creative players go to them to become members. Why is this important? It's because the rules, the regulations of how that body is run sits between two different acts. On the one hand, the Companies Act in the Kenyan scenario, because they are registered in Kenya as a company limited by guarantee. So how the company runs, how the company sets up its membership and its board, and how the AGMs are run are all governed by the provisions of the Companies Act. However, that organization, because it's going to be engaging with members of the public, needs to get a license under the Copyright Act and the Kenya Copyright Board. So understanding that they are not for profit means the only way they can generate revenue to run their operations is from this money that is collected. So there is a provision that a percentage, a reasonable percentage of their operation costs will come from the monies that are collected from the music users.
Just on that point, where the CMOs, the first point that you just talked about, I'd like probably either you or Kikubo to advise us. The accounts of the CMOs, are they supposed to be public, a public document? Are they supposed to table publicly their financial statements every year? What is the position? What is the legal position? I agree they are public, they're private companies, but they are collecting monies from the public.
Understood, and that's
so
my second point.
Basically, it's what we're looking for is a show of faith. That listen, you gave me 100 shillings. This is how I spent your 100 shillings. That's what we're looking at.
Understood, and that was going to be my second point. Because of the public interest element, you have seen in the media, like for example, let me use MCSK. They have made their figures publicly available. It is not on their website, okay? It is not something that is a legal requirement, but I understand the level of transparency that is required, not only for the music users, but for the members as well, because they will also need to know how this money is collected, how much is received, and how it is spent. And I think there's been work to that effect, but I think I will also allow the CMOs to respond on that specifically, and Kekobo. But in my opinion, because of the private company element, it may not be a strict legal obligation, but because of the public interest, there could be an element of some of it. And of course, there's stuff that is not publicly, it's not supposed to be shared publicly. So I think there's elements of those finances that could be considered as public information. All right, so we were on the issue of tariffs, which is, again, where this liaison relationship comes up. Again, you cannot approach each and every one of these venues. So this body is tasked with negotiating tariffs. A tariff is basically a formula of how much money will be collected for each use. There are various types of uses within the communication to the public use and public performance in public places. There are various parameters that could be used around the world, and none of them are wrong. But you have to find, through the negotiation, the best possible parameters. And many of these negotiations have been happening for the last decade or so. So this is not new, I believe, to all of you, because you have sat in meetings with CMOs and you have discussed, this doesn't work for me because a certain number of chairs doesn't apply. However, maybe if we use the area parameter, it would be more sensible or more fair. So these are not strange things. Well, the point I want to highlight here is that because tariffs are absolutely necessary and that there is a legal provision in the Act for negotiation to happen, there is an obligation on both the music user and the CMO on behalf of the rights holders to have a discussion and to conclude that discussion and then to honor the legal obligation in Section 30 and in Section 26, which is you're using, you must pay, all right? Then in terms of how, back to your point also, Martin, about the transparency, there's a document that each of the collective management organizations need to develop with the help of their members, which is once this money enters these accounts, how will it be paid out? That document is referred to as distribution rules, and it is something that, again, is never a static document. It keeps changing because different streams of revenue happen. When it first started and there was no digital exploitation, there was no provision for distribution rules for digital. However, when that happened, these things were now introduced. So there are documents, tariffs and distribution rules that govern money in and money out. Now, this was just a slide to show that, I know one of the questions that people keep asking is, why did these people just wake up one day and decide? Nobody decided. There's a provision. And as you can see, I tried to pick at least one country from each of the different major continents in the world, just to show you that the situation in Kenya is not unique at all. The collective management process is not a unique thing. It's not strange to Kenya. If you look at Norway, Norway has an organization called Tono. Tono is the equivalent of MCSK here because it handles the authors and composer rights of the music industry players in Norway. Gramo is a combined related rights body, so it would be the equivalent of a joint KAMP and PRISK here. In in India, there are three bodies. It's almost exactly like the situation that we have here. There's IPRS, which is the MCSK. PPL handles the sound recording owners, which is the KAMP here in Kenya. And ISRA is the body that handles the performers. It's the equivalent of PRISK. If we go right across to Tanzania, Tanzania has one body. All of these three sets of rights holders are combined in one, COSOTA. And COSOTA is also a good example of a country or an organization that has had their tariffs gazetted. And that's important because then once negotiations are concluded, you don't have the uncertainty. A lot of people bring up the issue of being able to budget. I don't want to pay in January and then by December you're already telling me that things are changing, yet I had put a provision in my budgets because we're all business people. We understand that budgets are necessary. So one of the benefits of also having these tariffs properly negotiated and gazetted is the element of being able to properly budget based on your legal obligations. If you look at the USA, this was interesting because ASCAP and BMI are two bodies just like MCSK. So whereas we sometimes think here that maybe the three are too much and it's like a double or triple billing type of situation, imagine the players in the US who have some authors and composers who are members of ASCAP and some authors and composers who are members of BMI. If you are a bar in the US and you were playing music from both of these types, rights holders who are in either, you would need to take out a license from both. That's the reality, okay? So that's just to give you a sort of a snapshot, and there's very many other examples, but it was too much to put on one slide. But please take the point that this is not unique to Kenya, and in some countries it's even more, what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of more broken up, that there are even more bodies than the three that we have here. So one of the major things that is being sought here is to seek to save time and to save financial resource. But this joint tariff that the CMOs are proposing has to cover all rights holders for all licensed uses, Why is that important? Because coming together has an implication of efficiency, yes, but it also means every single party has to be represented. Even just from the feedback that we received from previous conversations, because as I mentioned, this is not the first one. There was a belief that if I've paid one body or the other body, I need not pay. But from our very first slide, we saw that rights holders are in 3 main classes. And for all of these 3 classes of rights holders to get their fair, legally provided for dues, it would be necessary for the tariff to cover all of those players.
I was expecting you, Madam, to tell us what is the CMO's way of enforcement. I'm asking this because they come to our matatus with gun-wielding policemen confiscating our radios. How are they supposed to enforce to make sure that we pay for the tariffs?
Says somebody has not complied, so then something has had to be done to ensure compliance. So if we go back to, you've been called here as stakeholders in this industry with legal obligations according to the provisions of the statutes to pay because you are using. The decision to use was not forced upon anybody. It was a decision that different industries have decided to make. So if your members are using Banamashaya and there's a forum for negotiating tariffs that work for you and your members, as well as the rights holders, and that opportunity is not seized, so that during that negotiation, the amount that will be charged is clearly agreed on, the method, which is invoicing on an annual basis, on a quarterly basis, and then the method of collection. If those 3 things are not done, then enforcement becomes an issue because there's been a breach of the legal provisions.
I've just seen the proposed tariffs. I've not talked to that matatu owner.